All right, welcome everyone. We've got a great discussion lined up for you today, all thanks to my tax accountant. They're a pretty big name in the UK when it comes to, well, taxes and all that, and we're really zeroing in on something that's crucial for anyone out there who's about to start a new job. The new starter checklist.
Definitely, yeah. This form, it's like your passport to getting your tax right from day one, whether you're fresh out of school, jumping back in after some time off, or just switching to a different company.
Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, can you break down what this new starter checklist actually is? It's the point of it all.
Sure. It's basically how you give your new employer all the info they need to get your tax set up properly. It's a form, comes from HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the tax folks, and it's particularly important if you don't have a P45 from a previous job. Might ring a bell for some as the old P46.
Makes sense. But why is it so important to get this thing right? What's the big deal if you mess it up?
Well, the bottom line is it's all about making sure you're paying the right amount of income tax from your very first paycheck. The UK system, it's called Pay As You Earn, or PAYE for short. Huge system, handles something like 70 million pay slips every year, so they got to keep things organized. The new starter checklist basically feeds your employer the right info so they can slap the correct tax code on your earnings within that whole PAYE system.
And that's where it starts to hit home, right? Because a wrong tax code can really mess things up for your finances.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If that code's off, you could end up shelling out more tax than you should be, and then you have to go through the whole hassle of claiming a refund later. Talk about a pain. And even worse, you might underpay and get hit with a surprise tax bill. Not fun. HMRC actually put out some figures last year showing over 2 million employees were on the wrong tax code. So it's a pretty widespread issue, and this checklist is your first line of defense.
So let's get specific. Who actually needs to fill out this new starter checklist? Is it everyone who starts a new job?
Not necessarily, no. If you've got a P45 from your last employer, you just hand that over. And usually that's got all the tax info your new employer needs. But there are definitely a few groups for whom the checklist is super important. First off, anyone starting their very first job, never had a job before, no P45. So the checklist becomes your way of giving your initial tax details. And we're talking about a lot of people. Around 600,000 young people join the UK workforce every year, straight out of school or uni, and this checklist is usually their go-to.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, what about folks who've taken a break from work and are now heading back?
Totally. If you're coming back after a career break or any long stretch away from work and you don't have that P45 from your previous role, then you'll likely need to fill out the new starter checklist. We see around 1.2 million people returning to work every year after different kinds of breaks, and for many of them, this checklist is a must.
Now, student loans. That's a whole other layer of complexity when it comes to taxes, right? Does the checklist come in handy there too?
Definitely. Even if you do have a P45, if you're carrying a student loan, you'll pretty much always need to fill out the student loan section of the new starter checklist.
Right.
This is how you tell your employer which repayment plan you're on. Are you on Plan 1, Plan 2, Plan 4, or maybe a postgraduate loan? This bit's crucial because over 1.5 million people in the UK are repaying their student loans through the PYE system. So your employer needs to know which plan you're on to make the right deductions from your pay.
And what about people moving to the UK for work? Is there anything special they need to know about the checklist?
Right. For expats or folks seconded to the UK, there's usually a specific version of the new starter checklist tailored to their situation. It factors in things like residency and employment status to make sure their tax is handled correctly. And it's relevant for a fair number of people, too. About 250,000 non-UK nationals join the workforce here every year.
Now, are there any other less common situations where someone might find themselves needing to fill out one of these?
Yeah, a few spring to mind. Let's say you've lost your P45. Happens to the best of us, right? Well, the checklist can act as a backup, providing all the essential tax info to your new employer. Also, if you're starting a second job while still working somewhere else, you'll generally need to complete a checklist for that new role. And if you're making a transition, say, from unemployment benefits to starting a job, the checklist helps your employer figure out your tax situation for the year.
Okay, let's say you've got the checklist in front of you. What exactly are they going to ask for? What are the key bits of information you got to provide?
All right, so first off, it's the basic stuff. Your full name, home address, date of birth, and your national insurance number if you have it handy. Oh, and your employment start date, too. All this helps your employer properly ID you in the payroll and tax systems.
And then there's this thing called the employee statement, right? Sounds pretty official.
It is, yeah. This section asks you about any other jobs you might have if you're getting a pension, and really important, whether you've had any employment or received any taxable benefits, like job seekers allowance, since the tax year kicked off on April 6th. Your answers to these questions determine which of the three statements, A, B, or C, you need to choose. And this statement is what guides your employer in picking the right tax code for you.
Okay, let's break down those statements. What's the difference between A, B, and C?
All right, statement A is for those who are starting their first job since April 6th and haven't received any taxable benefits since then either. If this sounds like you, then your employer will usually apply your full personal allowance. For the 2024-25 tax year, that's £12,570, meaning the first 12,507 pesos you earn this tax year won't be taxed. Nice little bonus, eh?
So what about statement B? How is that different?
Statement B, that's for folks who have had a job or received taxable benefits since April 6th, but aren't currently employed or receiving those benefits. You still get the same personal allowance, but it's applied on what's called a week, 1 month, one basis. Basically, your tax-free allowance is calculated for each pay period, and whatever you don't use from previous pay periods doesn't carry over. So unlike statement A, it's not cumulative throughout the year.
All right, and statement C, that seems like a whole different situation.
Right on. Statement C, that's if you've got another job or are receiving a state, workplace, or private pension. If you go with statement C, your new employer will likely use the BR tax code. BR, that's basic rate, which means all the income from this specific job will be taxed at the basic rate of income tax, currently 20%. And you won't get any personal allowance on this income because it's assumed you're using your allowance against your other income source.
We talked about student loans earlier. What kind of details does the checklist ask for specifically?
Okay, so they'll ask you straight up if you have a student or postgraduate loan. If you say yes, then they'll want to know if any of these statements apply to you. Like, are you still a student? Did you just finish your course? Have you already paid off your loan? Or are you currently paying it off through direct debit? If none of those fit, then you'll need to say which student loan plan or plans you're on. Could be Plan 1, Plan 2, Plan 4, or postgraduate. And picking the right one is crucial because each plan has its own threshold for when repayments kick in. And for this tax year, 2024-25, those thresholds are different for each plan.
So you filled out the checklist, handed it to your employer. What happens next? What do they do with it?
Well, once they have your completed checklist, they've got a few important tasks. For starters, they have to keep that form on file by law for the current tax year and the 3 after that, just for record keeping and making sure they're compliant with the rules.
So they don't actually send it off to HMRC.
Nope, that's a key point. You give the checklist to your employer, but they don't mail that physical form to HMRC. Instead, they use that info to update their payroll system, and this data then goes into a digital report called the Full Payment Submission, or FPS. Employers send these FPS reports to HMRC regularly, detailing all their employees' pay and deductions, like tax and national insurance. We're talking huge numbers here. Over 60 million FPS submissions every year in the UK, and about 1.5 million of those are related to new employees.
So it's that employee statement A, B, or C that helps them figure out what initial tax code to use, right?
Exactly. Based on the statement you picked, your employer will apply an initial tax code. Like we discussed, Statement A usually leads to the standard personal allowance code. Statement B, that's the same allowance, but on that week, 1 month, one basis. And Statement C, that's the basic rate BR code.
And for those with student loans, the employer uses the checklist to set up those repayments too.
Yep, spot on. They're responsible for setting up those student loan deductions based on the specific loan plan you indicated. And once your earnings hit the repayment threshold for your plan, the deductions will automatically come out of your salary and get sent to the student loans company through the payroll system.
So we've covered what the checklist is and how it works.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the why. Why is it so important to get this right? What could happen if someone makes mistakes?
Well, the main point is to make sure your tax deductions are accurate. If you mess up the info on the checklist, you could end up with the wrong tax code. Like we talked about earlier, this can lead to overpaying tax all year, leaving you with less money in your pocket and having to go through the headache of claiming a refund later. Or you could underpay and get slammed with an unexpected tax bill at the end of the year. Neither of those are good options.
And I've heard this term emergency tax codes thrown around. What are those all about, and how do they fit into this whole checklist situation?
So, emergency tax codes, things like 0T, those are often used when an employer doesn't have enough information to work out the right tax code. Could happen if a new employee hasn't given them a P45 and hasn't filled out the new starter checklist. The problem is, these emergency codes can really slash your take-home pay because they usually don't consider your personal tax-free allowance. And the numbers show it's a real issue. About 10% of new starters who don't give a P45 or a completed checklist get put on an emergency tax code at first.
So yeah, definitely in everyone's best interest to get this sorted right from the start, avoid those potential headaches. What about the employers, though? Are there any consequences for them if they mess up these submissions?
Oh, for sure. Employers have a responsibility to make sure they're sending accurate payroll info to HMRC. If they get things wrong on those full payment submissions, they can face penalties. It can start at £100 per month for late or incorrect submissions, and it can go up from there depending on the size of the business and how often they're making mistakes. No one wants that.
Sounds like a good reason for everyone to pay close attention to the new starter checklist. Is there anything else that's changed recently or that people should know about?
Yeah, actually, HMRC is pushing the digital side of things more and more. You can often find and complete the new starter checklist online now through the gov.uk website. It's all about making things smoother, more efficient, and cutting down on errors that can happen with paper forms.
So to wrap it all up, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember about this checklist?
The big takeaway is that the new starter checklist is a crucial first step for anyone in the UK starting a new job. Fill it out accurately, give it to your new employer right away, and you're setting yourself up for success. It's the best way to make sure you're paying the right amount of tax from day one, and it helps you avoid all those potential financial and administrative nightmares, like getting stuck with the wrong tax code or dealing with those dreaded emergency tax situations.
Couldn't agree more. And just to reiterate, you can usually find this checklist on gov.uk. And remember, hand it directly to your employer, not to HMRC.
That's it. They'll handle the rest, using that information for their payroll submissions to HMRC.
Now, if anyone listening has more specific questions or needs personalized advice about the new starter checklist and how it applies to their unique situation, who should they reach out to?
If you need more info or want tailored guidance on the new starter checklist and how it all works for your specific tax situation, I highly recommend you contact the experts at My Tax Accountant directly. They've got the knowledge to help you out.
Perfect. Well, that wraps up our discussion for today, all brought to you by My Tax Accountant. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.